The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic, hypnotic rattle, a sound that could pull a $20 bill from a dead man's wallet. It was the summer of '71, and the air over the Polk County Fairgrounds was thick with the smells of diesel, dust, and desperation. Men in seed corn hats and sweat-stained work shirts stood in tight knots, their faces grim, sizing up their neighbors' misfortunes laid bare on hay wagons and patches of sun-scorched grass. This was where farms came to die, their iron bones picked clean before the land itself was sold on the courthouse steps. I was 24, my father not 6 months in the ground, and the weight of his 300 acres felt like a tombstone on my own shoulders. I wasn't there to buy, I was there to watch, to learn the grim calculus of failure. I walked past a John Deere 40-10 with faded paint and a leaky rear seal, a Farmall H that looked like it had been pulled from a river, a collection of plows, discs, and planters that told a story of a lifetime of labor ending in a whisper. And then I saw it. It wasn't with the other farm equipment. It was shoved off to the side, near the scrap iron pile, a monument of rust and neglect. An Alice Chalmers HD-21 bulldozer. It was a monster, a relic from the late 50s, 30 tons of raw American steel. Its massive blade was pitted and scarred, the cutting edge worn into a dull, wavy line. The tracks were half sunk in the mud, each link the size of a loaf of bread. A thick coat of faded, chalky orange paint was blistered and peeling, revealing the dark, corroded metal beneath. A small tree was growing up through the open engine compartment, where the side panels had long since vanished. It looked less like a machine and more like a fossil. The old men, the ones who knew, gave it a wide berth. They shook their heads and spat tobacco juice. "That thing ain't turned over since the Johnson administration," one of them muttered. "Belonged to old man Hemmings. Tried to clear the bottoms with it, threw a rod and parked it. That was 10 years ago." I circled it like a wolf. I saw the heart of it. A colossal Buddha diesel engine. A straight six big enough to power a small ship. The injector lines were rusted solid, the radiator was smashed in on one side, and a family of birds had built a nest in the exhaust stack. It was a catastrophe. It was beautiful. "Looking to buy yourself a boat, Anchor? Miller." The voice was slick with arrogance. I didn't have to turn around to know it was Richard Peterson. Rich. His father ran the Farmers' Trust and Savings, which meant he ran the county. Rich drove a new Camaro, wore clean jeans to the diner, and had just taken delivery of a brand-new John Deere 46-20, complete with a soundproofed cab, air conditioning, and an 8-track player. He was the future. I was, apparently, the past. He sauntered up next to me, thumbs hooked in his belt. "My God, Art, you could sell that thing to the Russians for scrap and buy yourself a decent cultivator. What in the hell would you even do with it?" "I don't know yet," I said, my voice low. I ran a hand over the cold steel of a trackpad. The grit felt honest. "Well, whatever it is, you'll be doing it slow," he laughed. The little group of farmers around him chuckled along with him. It was the kind of laughter that greased the wheels of commerce and influence in a small town. You laugh with the banker's son. It's just good business. The auctioneer finally moved toward the beast. "All right, boys, let's get this out of the way. Lot 347, one Alice Chalmers bulldozer. As is. Where is? We got no idea if it runs, and frankly, I doubt God himself could make it run. We're selling it for scrap weight. Let's start the bidding at $200. Who'll give me 200? Silence. The crows in the distant oaks were louder. $200, boys. The blade alone is worth that. Come on now, 200. Rich Peterson let out a loud, theatrical sigh. Lord, just haul it to the scrap yard, Earl. You're embarrassing the poor thing." More laughter. My face burned. My father had taught me 2 things. Never owe a man a nickel you can't pay back tonight, and never mistake silence for weakness. I felt a slow, cold anger coil in my gut. $100, I said. My voice didn't sound like my own. It cut through the quiet, thin and sharp. The auctioneer, Earl, looked at me, his eyes wide with surprise. Every head turned. Rich Peterson stared at me, his smirk frozen on his face. He looked me up and down, taking in my worn boots, my patched jeans, the grease under my fingernails. He saw a boy playing at being a man. "Well, I got 100, Earl stammered, recovering. "Who'll give 150? 150? Silence. "Come on, Rich," one of his friends nudged him. "Don't let the boy have it. It'll look bad." Rich just shook his head, a look of pity on his face. "Let him. Some lessons you got to learn with your own wallet." "Sold!" Earl's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. "For $100 to Art Miller." The murmuring started immediately. A fool and his money. He just bought himself a 10-ton headache. Old man Miller must be spinning in his grave. I ignored it all. I walked to the Clark's trailer, counted out 5 worn $20 bills from my father's old leather wallet, and signed the bill of sale. It was the last of the cash he'd left me. Getting it home was the next circle of hell. The dozer weighed close to 60,000 pounds. No farmer had a trailer that could touch it. I had to call a heavy hauling outfit from Des Moines. The dispatcher laughed when I told him what I needed to move and where it was. It cost me $400, money I had to pull from the farm's operating account, the account that was supposed to buy seed and fertilizer for next spring. The lowboy rig arrived the next day, a giant Peterbilt that hissed and groaned as it backed up to the dead machine. It took the driver and me 4 hours with 2 heavy-duty winches, a lot of chain, and more swearing than I'd ever heard in one place to drag the HD-21 onto the trailer. The sound of its frozen tracks scraping across the gravel was a sound of pure agony. As we chained it down, Rich Peterson drove by in his new John Deere, the cab gleaming in the sun. He slowed down, shook his head in mock sadness, and then roared away, leaving me in a cloud of dust and derision. That evening, the dozer sat in my farmyard, squatting in the twilight like some prehistoric beast. It was bigger than my barn. It blocked the view of the cornfields. It was an ugly, silent, immovable testament to my foolishness. The mortgage payment was due in 3 weeks. The operating account was nearly empty. The entire county thought I was a fool. As the last light of day faded and the enormity of my gamble settled upon me, I could almost hear their laughter echoing on the prairie wind. Before we get into the grease and the grime of bringing this monster back to life, I gotta ask you folks something. Have you ever taken a gamble so big, so utterly foolish in the eyes of everyone else, that you could feel their laughter in your bones? Let me know down in the comments what that one crazy bet was for you. Because for Art Miller, this wasn't just a bet. It was everything. The work began not with a wrench, but with a shovel. Years of accumulated dirt, leaves and rust had packed into every crevice. I spent 2 days just digging the machine out of its own filth. Then came the pressure washer, peeling back layers of grime to reveal the true extent of the decay. The steel was pitted like a man's face after a bout with smallpox. This wasn't just a repair job. It was an archaeological dig. The heart of the beast was the Buddha diesel. I pulled the massive hood off with my Farmall M and a chain, the metal groaning in protest. What I saw inside made my stomach sink. Mouse nests, packed tight as insulation, filled the spaces between the block and the manifold. Wires were chewed through, their copper guts spilling out. I put a 4-foot breaker bar on the front crankshaft bolt and leaned into it with all my weight. It didn't budge, not a fraction of an inch. The engine was seized tighter than a banker's fist. This is where most men would have called the scrapper. This is where common sense tells you to cut your losses. But my father's blood was in me, and he was a man who could fix anything with a piece of baling wire and sheer cussedness. I saw it not as a problem, but as a puzzle. A heavy, greasy, impossible puzzle. I spent a week just trying to get the cylinder head off. The bolts were the size of my wrists, and they hadn't been turned in more than a decade. I heated them with an acetylene torch until they glowed cherry red, then quenched them with cold water, hoping the shock would break the rust's grip. The barn filled with the acrid smell of burning oil and hot metal. One by one, with the help of a 6-foot cheetah pipe on my breaker bar, the bolts gave way with a sound like a gunshot. When I finally lifted the head with the engine hoist, the sight was devastating. All 6 cylinders were filled with dark, brackish water that had seeped in through the open exhaust stack. The cylinder walls were scored with deep grooves of rust. The pistons were fused to the sleeves. The talk at the co-op in town had shifted from mockery to a kind of morbid curiosity. "Heard Art Miller's trying to unseize that old Alice," they'd say over coffee. "More likely to teach a pig to sing." Rich Peterson would hold court there, explaining with great authority how the block was surely cracked, the crankshaft warped. "He's pouring good money after bad," he'd declare, shaking his head with false sympathy. "Sad to see what's become of the Miller place." Every time I drove into town in my old Ford F-100 for parts, I felt their eyes on me. I was the town fool, the boy who bought the laughingstock of the county auction. My fields were a mess. I'd only had time to get the corn planted, and I did it late. The rows were uneven. The weeds were already starting to get a foothold. Rich's fields, which bordered mine to the north, were a perfect emerald green carpet. His new planter had put the seed in with surgical precision. My farm looked like a junkyard. His looked like a page from a magazine. I ignored them. My world shrank to the space under the bare bulb hanging in my barn. I drained the rusty water from the cylinders and began the slow, patient process of resurrection. I mixed up a concoction my grandfather had sworn by, half-automatic transmission fluid, half acetone. It was a penetrating oil that could creep into the tightest spaces. For 2 weeks, every morning and every night, I filled the cylinders with it, letting it soak, hoping it would work its magic on the rust. The nights were the hardest. I'd sit on an overturned bucket, drinking stale coffee, looking at that silent engine. The silence was the enemy. It was the sound of failure. I'd think about the mortgage, about the smirks on the faces in town. I was running on fumes, living off canned beans and the stubborn belief that I could beat this thing. To find parts, I became a detective. There was no Alice Chalmers dealer that stocked parts for a 20-year-old industrial dozer. I spent hours on our old party line telephone, the voices of neighbors cutting in and out, as I tried to talk to grizzled old men in salvage yards in Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri. Most of them laughed. A few remembered the machine. One, a man named Gus out of western Iowa, said he might have something. I drove the 4 hours in my pickup, the cab smelling of gasoline and desperation. Gus's salvage yard was a graveyard of iron giants, old drag lines, ancient earth movers, and rusted-out combines lay in silent rows, slowly being consumed by the earth. Gus was a man made of leather and gristle. He led me through the mud to a heap of parts and pointed with a greasy finger. There it was, the cylinder head from an HD-21 that had been cannibalized for its transmission years ago. It was in rough shape, but it was better than mine. I paid him $75 and a bottle of whiskey, and we loaded it into the back of my Ford. The whole way home, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Back in my barn, I continued the assault on the seized pistons. After 2 weeks of soaking, I put the breaker bar back on the crankshaft. I pulled. The bar bent under the strain. The engine remained motionless. I slid a 10-foot steel pipe over the handle of the breaker bar for more leverage. I put every ounce of my being into it. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes. I grunted, cursed, and pulled until I saw stars. And then I heard it. Not a bang, but a groan. A deep, metallic, agonizing screech. It had moved, just a fraction of an inch. But it had moved. I felt a surge of adrenaline that was better than coffee, better than sleep. For the next 6 hours, I worked the engine back and forth, a fraction of an inch at a time, adding more penetrating oil, feeling the rust slowly, grudgingly, give up its hold. By dawn, I could make the crankshaft complete a full, painful revolution. The siege was broken. The heart of the beast was beating again, if only by my own hand. The year was 1973. The world had changed. Richard Nixon was in the White House. The Vietnam War was winding down, and something incredible was happening in the fields of the American Midwest. The Soviet Union, facing a catastrophic crop failure, had secretly agreed to buy nearly a quarter of the entire U.S. grain harvest. The news, when it broke, hit the commodities market like a bolt of lightning. The price of corn, which had hovered around $1 a bushel for as long as anyone could remember, shot up to $2, then $3. A wave of unbelievable prosperity washed over the heartland. The new gospel, preached from on high by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, was get big or get out. Farmers were told to plant fence row to fence row, to tear out the windbreaks and drain the wetlands, to squeeze every last bushel from the soil. And the banks, led by men like Rich Peterson's father, were more than happy to provide the fuel for the fire. Money was cheap. Loans were easy. The future looked as bright and limitless as the prairie sky. Rich Peterson became the golden boy of the boom. He was no longer just the banker's son. He was a tycoon in the making. He used his father's bank to leverage his existing land and bought out 2 of our neighbors who were nearing retirement. His operation swelled from 500 acres to over 1,500. He traded in his nearly new 4620 for the biggest tractor the International Harvester dealer had on the lot, a 1466 Turbo. It was a monster, with dual rear wheels, a gleaming red paint job, and a turbocharged engine that screamed like a jet fighter as he tore across his fields. He bought a new Gleaner combine, a new grain truck, and built a set of towering silver grain bins that dwarfed every barn in the township. At the diner, he'd talk about cash flow and depreciation, about interest rates and land values. "You got to be aggressive," he'd say, leaning back in his chair. "Land's not going anywhere but up. This is the new reality. A guy who isn't expanding right now is going backwards. Guys like Art Miller. Well, you hate to see it. Stuck in the past with that junk pile of his. He's missing the opportunity of a lifetime." They all nodded in agreement. I was the cautionary tale. While they were all getting rich, I was still wrestling with my iron beast. But they didn't know the whole story. By the fall of '72, I had gotten the HD21 running. The day that big Buddha diesel finally fired up is burned into my memory. I had rebuilt the carburetor, rewired the ignition, and put the refurbished cylinder head on with a new gasket. I bled the fuel lines and cranked the starter. It turned over, slow and protesting, and then a puff of white smoke came from the stack, then a puff of black. With a deep, house-shaking roar, the engine caught. It belched a column of black smoke so thick it blotted out the sun, a decade's worth of carbon and rust and fury. The ground trembled. The windows of the barn rattled in their frames. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. But I didn't use the dozer to expand my own farm. I couldn't afford to. Instead, I started a side business. I painted Miller Land Improvement on the cab doors with a stencil and a can of white paint. I charged by the hour. My first job was for an old farmer on the other side of the county, clearing out a fence line that was choked with 30 years of brush and volunteer trees. The work was brutal. The dozer had no cab, just a steel canopy over the seat. In the summer, the heat from the engine was relentless. In the fall, the cold wind cut right through you. But the machine was unstoppable. It pushed over trees, shoved aside boulders, and carved paths through terrain nothing else could touch. I dug stock ponds for cattlemen. I terraced hillsides for farmers worried about erosion. I cleared land for a new housing development on the edge of town. The work was slow and steady. It wasn't the spectacular windfall my neighbors were getting from corn, but it was cash. And every dollar I made went to one place, the bank. I didn't spend it on new equipment. I kept nursing my old Farmall M along. I didn't buy a new truck. I kept patching up the old Ford. I made my regular mortgage payment every month, and then I'd add another $100, sometimes $200, directly to the principal. One afternoon in late 1973, I went into the Farmers' Trust and Savings to make one of these extra payments. Mr. Peterson, Rich's father, called me into his office. He was a man who looked like he was carved from granite, all sharp angles and cold grey eyes. He looked at my payment slip and sighed, a sound of deep disappointment. "Arthur," he said, leaning back in his big leather chair, "we need to talk about your future. This is commendable." He gestured at the slip. "But it's small thinking. The prime interest rate is starting to move. It's up to 8% now. But that's nothing. Inflation is taking off. The smart money, Arthur, the smart money is borrowing, leveraging your assets." He slid a loan application across his polished desk. "Your land value has doubled in the last 2 years. Doubled. You have equity just sitting there, doing nothing. Take out a loan. Buy that 80 acres next to you. Buy a new tractor. My Rich, he understands. He's going to clear over $100,000 this year. 100,000! And here you are, paying down a low-interest loan from the 60s. You're losing money by being frugal." I looked at the loan application, then back at him. "I appreciate the advice, Mr. Peterson, but my father always said, the quickest way to lose the farm is to bet it." His face hardened. "Your father was a good man, Arthur, but he was a man of his time. This is a new era. You're going to get left behind." I just nodded, took my receipt, and walked out. The air in the bank felt suffocating. On the radio behind the teller's cage, a man with a serious voice was talking. I only caught a few words. Oil embargo, soaring inflation, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, rising interest rates. I stepped out into the bright autumn sunshine. Across the street, Rich was climbing into a brand-new Lincoln Continental. He gave me a little wave, the kind a king gives to a peasant. I looked down at my receipt, the paper warm in my hand. My loan balance was smaller today than it was yesterday. Then I looked out, past the town, toward the horizon where Rich's vast, immaculate, and heavily mortgaged fields lay. A cold breeze rustled the dying leaves on the town square's oak trees, and for the first time I felt a deep, chilling sense of dread. The party was loud, the music was playing, but somewhere, far off, I could hear the first rumbles of a coming storm. The boom years rolled on, a tidal wave of paper prosperity. By 1977, the price of prime Iowa farmland had quadrupled from what it was at the start of the decade. Rich Peterson was the king of this new order. He bought another farm, pushing his holdings to over 2,000 acres. He traded his International 1466 for a brand-new Steiger Panther, an articulated four-wheel drive monster that could pull a 30-foot chisel plow. He was the first in the county to own one. He built a new house on a hill overlooking his empire, a sprawling brick ranch with a 3-car garage and a paved driveway. He was no longer farming. He was managing an agricultural enterprise. My life followed a different rhythm. The dozer work was my salvation. It was hard, dirty, and dangerous, but it was honest. I terraced the rolling hills south of the river. I cleared tangled bottomland for pasture. I dug ponds that shimmered like dropped coins in the summer sun. The HD-21 became a local legend. It was ugly, loud, and it leaked oil from every seal. But it never quit. Its big Buddha diesel had a deep, throaty roar that was the sound of progress for the small farmers who hired me. The money I made wasn't spectacular, but it was steady, and it all went against the loan. In the spring of 1978, I walked into the Farmers' Trust and Savings and made my final mortgage payment, 10 years ahead of schedule. Mr. Peterson accepted the check with a look that was a mixture of confusion and disapproval. He couldn't understand it. In his world, debt was a tool, a lever to create wealth. To be without it was like a carpenter refusing to use a hammer. "Congratulations, Arthur," he said, his voice flat. "You now own 300 acres of severely underutilized capital." I just smiled, folded my paid-in-full note, and put it in my shirt pocket. It felt heavier than gold. The first sign that the world was changing came not from the banks or the commodity markets, but from the sky. The summer of '78 started hot and stayed that way. The rains stopped in June. The corn, which had shot up tall and green, began to show stress. The broad leaves started to curl inward during the heat of the day, a plant's desperate attempt to conserve moisture. They called it pineappling. By mid-July, the fields were a sickly yellow-green. The ground cracked open in patterns like broken pottery. The ponds I had dug years before shrank, their edges turning into wide, muddy rings. My old Farmall M didn't seem to notice. It just chugged along as I cultivated my struggling corn, kicking up clouds of fine, brown dust. One afternoon, I was finishing a pass near the fence line I shared with Rich Peterson. On his side, his giant Steiger sat silent. I could see him standing beside it, his hands on his hips, staring at the engine compartment. It had been sitting there for 2 days. Later, I heard the talk at the co-op. The turbocharger had failed, a catastrophic breakdown that had sent metal fragments through the entire engine. The repair bill was over $10,000, and they had to fly a mechanic in from Moline to do the work. For a week, at the most critical time for his crops, Rich's flagship tractor was dead in the water. My corn was suffering, but I had an advantage. My father, a man who had lived through the Dust Bowl of the '30s, had never torn out the old windbreaks. He had left wide grass waterways in the hollows to prevent erosion. While Rich had planted every square inch, fence row to fence row, my land held the moisture better. My yields would be down, way down, but I would have a crop. Rich's fields, exposed to the hot, dry winds, were a disaster. The corn was stunted, the ears small and poorly filled. The harvest was a nightmare for him. His massive Gleaner combine, designed for high yields, struggled with the sparse crop. Worse yet, the dry, gritty dust was hell on the complex machinery. One sweltering afternoon in September, I saw the combine stop in the middle of a pass. A plume of hydraulic fluid shot into the air, shimmering in the sunlight, before settling as a dark stain on the parched earth. A main hydrostatic drive hose had burst. It was another expensive, time-consuming repair. He lost 3 days of harvesting. I finished my own meager harvest with my old Alice Chalmers pull-type combine, a simple, clattering machine that I could fix with a crescent wrench and a hammer. The drought broke that fall, but it was replaced by a different kind of poison. Inflation was out of control. The price of fuel, fertilizer, and parts was climbing by the week. And then came the news from Washington. The Federal Reserve, under a new chairman named Paul Volcker, was going to war against inflation. He was going to do it by raising interest rates. At first, nobody understood what it meant. Interest rates were something bankers talked about. But then the letters started arriving. The operating loans that farmers took out every spring, the ones they had been rolling over for years, were being rewritten. The rates jumped from 9% to 12%, then to 15%. Rich Peterson and hundreds of others like him had their entire operations financed on these variable rate loans. His father's bank, which had seemed like such an advantage, was now his jailer. The bank had to pay higher interest to its depositors, so it had to charge higher interest to its borrowers. There was no way out. Rich was trapped. The final hammer blow fell in 1980. In response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, President Carter declared a grain embargo. The export market, the very foundation of the 1970s boom, vanished overnight. The price of corn collapsed, falling by half. The math no longer worked. You couldn't make a profit growing $3 corn when it cost you $4 to produce it. You couldn't make payments on $500,000 loans with interest rates climbing past 20%. The prosperity of the 70s was revealed to be a mirage, a fever dream built on cheap money and ever-rising land values. Now the money was expensive, the grain was worthless, and the price of land was in free fall. The wave had crested, and now it was pulling everything back out to sea. The auctions started again. But these weren't like the auctions of the early 70s. They were different, angrier, more desperate. You'd see whole families standing by their equipment, their faces hollow with shock, as the auctioneer sold off a lifetime of work, piece by piece. The crowds were quiet, grim. There was no gloating, only the shared terror that you could be next. The buyers weren't neighbors looking for a bargain. They were salvage dealers and representatives from faceless insurance companies and out-of-state investment groups, picking the bones clean. Rich Peterson held on longer than most. His father protected him as best he could, extending his credit, restructuring his loans. But the bank itself was in trouble. Too many of its loans were going bad. Federal examiners were crawling all over their books. In the fall of 1982, the inevitable happened. A notice appeared in the county paper, a small block of text buried in the legal section. The Farmers' Trust and Savings, acting on behalf of its creditors, was foreclosing on the assets of Peterson Farms, Incorporated. The auction was set for a cold Saturday in November. The sky was the color of lead, and a bitter wind whipped across the prairie, carrying the first hints of snow. I drove my old Ford pickup to Rich's farm, the same farm he had built into an empire, the one with the big brick house on the hill. The paved driveway was now cracked and full of potholes. The yard was packed with the trucks of other farmers, all of them there for the same morbid reason, to watch a king fall. His equipment was lined up in a long, sad row. The giant Steiger tractor, the big Gleaner combine, the gleaming silver grain trucks. They looked like dinosaurs waiting for the meteor. They were symbols of a future that had never arrived. Now they were just collateral. Rich was there, standing near the machine shed. He looked 10 years older. His face was thin and pale, his eyes sunk deep in their sockets. He wore a cheap work coat, not the fancy insulated jackets he used to favor. He was standing alone. The men who had once laughed at his jokes and sought his advice now avoided his gaze, shuffling past him as if he were a ghost. His father was nowhere to be seen. I heard later he'd had a stroke. I didn't go to gloat. I felt a profound sadness. He had been arrogant, a fool even, but he had loved the land in his own way. He had just believed in the wrong gospel. I walked over to him. He saw me coming and tensed, expecting an insult, a moment of, "I told you so." "Rich," I said, my voice quiet. He just stared at me, his jaw tight. "Come to enjoy the show, Miller? Come to pick over the scraps?" "No," I said. "I'm sorry this happened." A flicker of something, surprise, confusion, crossed his face. He looked away, out at the lines of machinery and the crowd of stony-faced men. "They all said I was smart," he whispered, his voice cracking. "My father, the university, the bankers, they all said, 'Get big or get out.' They said debt was a tool. They called it leverage." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Well, it leveraged me right into the ground." The auctioneer started with the small items, the tools and shop equipment. Then he moved to the big iron. The Steiger, which had cost Rich over $150,000 just a few years before, sold for $30,000 to a corporate farm from Illinois. The Gleaner Combine went for even less. It was a bloodbath. The value of his assets didn't even come close to covering the mountain of his debt. I stayed until the end. The auctioneer finally got to the last and most important items, the land. They sold it off in parcels. The 1,000 acres he had bought on contract went back to the original owners. The 500 acres he had clear title to were sold to an insurance company. Finally, they came to the original Peterson home quarter, the 160 acres with the big brick house on the hill. "All right, folks, here it is," the auctioneer called out, his voice hoarse. "The home place. 160 acres more or less, with house and outbuildings. A prime piece of Polk County land. What am I bid?" An uneasy silence fell over the crowd. This was different. This wasn't just a parcel number. It was a man's home. A lawyer representing the bank started the bidding at $1,000 an acre, a fraction of what it had been worth 5 years earlier. Another man, a stranger in a suit, raised the bid. They went back and forth, the price slowly climbing. I looked over at Rich. He was watching, his face a mask of stone, as strangers bartered for his birthright. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do. $1,200 an acre, I said. My voice was clear and steady. Every head turned. The auctioneer squinted at me. Rich's eyes went wide. The man in the suit looked irritated. He conferred with another man, then shook his head. "I have 1,200, the auctioneer said. "Do I hear 13? Silence. "Sold," the gavel cracked, "for $192,000 to Art Miller." I walked to the clerk's table, my legs feeling unsteady. I didn't have the money in my pocket, but I had it. It was the money I had saved from the dozer work, the money I had kept safe in certificates of deposit, earning interest while everyone else was borrowing. It was almost everything I had. After I signed the papers, I found Rich by his pickup truck. He was just sitting in the driver's seat, staring at nothing. I walked up to the open window. "Why?" he asked, his voice thick. "Why would you do that? To humiliate me? To own my home?" "No," I said. I reached into my coat and pulled out a piece of paper. It was a rental agreement I had drawn up with my lawyer the day before. "I'm going to lease it back to you. For $1 a year. You and your family can stay in the house. You can farm the land. When you get back on your feet, you can buy it back from me for exactly what I paid for it. Not a penny more." He stared at the paper, then up at me. His face, which had been a mask of hard bitterness, began to crumble. His eyes filled with tears. He took the paper, his hand trembling. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, a broken man accepting a grace he had never expected and felt he didn't deserve. I walked away and didn't look back. The wind was cold, but I didn't feel it. I looked at my own hands, calloused and stained with grease. They weren't the hands of a tycoon or a financial genius. They were the hands of a farmer. And for the first time, I understood what my father had really taught me. It wasn't just about being frugal or avoiding debt. It was about knowing the difference between what is valuable and what just has a price. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. The 1980s were lean years for everyone, but we survived. I kept my operation small and my overhead low. I did my own repairs, nursed the old equipment along, and lived within my means. The HD-21, my old iron beast, kept working. It wasn't a symbol of foolishness anymore. Now, when people saw it parked in my yard, they saw it for what it was. A symbol of survival. It had been my ark in the flood. Rich and I never became close friends, but a quiet respect grew between us. He farmed the home place, and slowly, year by year, he began to heal. He was a different man, humbled and quieted by his failure. He learned to fix his own machinery, to watch his expenses, to find satisfaction in a straight corn row instead of a rising balance sheet. 7 years after the auction, he walked into my kitchen with a cashier's check and bought his farm back. We shook hands, two middle-aged men who had seen the world change and had, in our own ways, survived it. Years passed. The farm economy recovered. A new generation came of age, one that had never known the terror of 20% interest rates or the heartbreak of a foreclosure auction. My own son grew tall and strong, with my father's eyes and my hands. One sunny afternoon, when he was about 16, I found him out in the grove, circling the old HD-21. It sat retired now, a monument of faded orange paint, its work mostly done. "Dad," he said, running a hand over the massive, scarred blade. "Some of the kids at school were talking. Their dads are buying all this new stuff. Tractors with GPS and computers that practically drive themselves. Why do we still have all this old junk?" He gestured toward my Farmall M, still the main tractor on our place. I walked over and stood beside him, putting a hand on his shoulder. The steel of the dozer was warm from the sun. "This junk, as you call it," I said, "is the reason we're still standing here. It's the reason this land has our name on it, and not some corporations." I told him the whole story, about the auction in '71, about Rich Peterson's mockery, about the seized engine and the long nights in the barn. I told him about the boom years, about the bankers who promised a future that was too good to be true, and I told him about the crash, about the bitter wind at Rich's auction, and the look on the faces of men who had lost everything. "These new tractors are fine things," I told him, my voice low. "They can do amazing work, but you have to understand something. When you borrow $500,000 to buy one, it's not really yours. It belongs to the bank. It owns you. This," I slapped the solid steel fender of the dozer. "This old beast, I bought it for $100. It asked for nothing but sweat and grease. It never sent me a bill. It never charged me interest. It taught me that the most important thing a man can own is himself." He was quiet for a long time, looking from the dozer to the fields stretching out before us, green and full of life under the Iowa sun. He looked at my hands, then at his own, just beginning to show the calluses of farm work. "I think I understand," he said, and for the first time, I saw the man he was going to become. I still have the dozer. It doesn't run much anymore, but I keep it in the shed, protected from the weather. Sometimes on a quiet evening, I'll go out there and just sit in the worn steel seat, my hands on the levers. I'll look out over the land my father left me, the land I almost lost, the land that is now safe for my son. And I'll think about the rhythmic, hypnotic rattle of an auctioneer's voice, and the silence of a crowd, and the deep, earth-shaking roar of an old engine coming back to life. It's the sound of a lesson learned. It's the sound of being free.